About non-dualism and consciousness. It is important to understand that non-dualism primarily should refer to one's mental attitude or philosophical outlook on the interconnection between all things and all phenomena. It does not necessarily mean that things in nature cannot be relatively separate in terms of independent parts, even though they influence and have an effect on one another. Because sometimes people will take this concept of non-dualism too far, which is what leads to things like the mind-body problem in philosophy. When I was looking at Leo Gura's videos on YouTube, I came across a channel called Unspirituality that was picking apart several doctrines that claim to be non-dualistic. This guy, although he seems to be more developed than Leo or Teal Swan for example, didn't believe that there was more to consciousness than neurons firing up in the brain. Because anything else would be dualism according to him, a separation of the soul from the body. He even summed it up by saying, if it teaches about life after death, it's dualism. But using that standard, isn't it already dualism if death is different from life? Is it dualism to claim that the electricity powering up a machine is independent from the machine? In nature you can point out discrete things everywhere, because our world is a dance of opposites. Non-dualism, as far as I have concluded, is primarily about how you perceive things that appear to be separate. And in some sense they are separate. Water is separate from fire is separate from air is separate from earth, and so on. Wind affects the earth and oceans without having to be earth or water. And in fact, the only way we can perceive wind is through its effect on matter. There are invisible things we cannot see, yet they exist in relationship and connection with things we can see. Same thing with sound, gravity, and consciousness or life force of living beings. A dead animal generates life force within a living being that eats it, even though the substance being consumed is not alive. And so I don't understand why the body and the soul, or the brain and consciousness, cannot have a similar, interconnected, yet distinct and separate relationship. Because a non-dual perspective is fundamentally about perceiving the relationship of things, the cause and effect, not that everything is the same. Leo got hung up on this in a different way, saying that right now you are also everything in the universe. This is an exaggeration of non-dualism, taking it into an absurd, literal, impractical extreme. No, non-dualism is about not judging and not demonizing any part of nature. It's about having a balanced, holistic picture of reality. Not philosophically smashing things together, not reducing everything to mere fantasy, like the pseudo-spiritualists do, or reducing everything to mere matter or biology, like unspirituality do. What unspirituality talks about sounds like property dualism, which is emergent materialism. Oneness is about interconnection and the importance and necessity of all the seemingly isolated parts, and how nothing can be judged or improved without taking all of the context and circumstances that's having an effect on this particular thing or cause into consideration. At least this is the definition and proper place of non-dualism in timeless education. That does not mean that timeless education has any specific view on what happens after physical death. The reason why I personally lean towards reincarnation is not because of the doctrines of many traditions, since it could be argued that reincarnation after physical death is simply a later misunderstanding of a concept that originally revolved around psychological processes, psychological rebirth within the same mind. But since ancient metaphysics and psychology used synthesis and the expression of analogy, it's possible that they also meant to imply that reincarnation happens at several layers of reality, including the process of physical life and death. But what really made me open to reincarnation were stories and personal anecdotes of past life memories that could later be verified in their details. The best one being Robert Snow's story as told in the book Looking for Carol Beckwith. So let me just summarize how timeless education regards consciousness and matter as phenomena. Keep in mind that it is not necessary to adopt this view in order to become developed, but I think it could help, and I might also update this view in the future. It is to be regarded as something of a placeholder, since we've currently got nothing better, but it is as close as I can get to a timeless philosophical view on consciousness, meaning a conclusion that could be arrived at any time in history. Otherwise, we become slaves to authorities and open to delusion and indoctrination. If we arrive at our own conclusion, then at least we know why we arrived at it, and why we believe what we do. And we don't arrogantly or impatiently expect others to simply believe it also. The main purpose of having our own independent worldview, arrived at through philosophy, is primarily not to convince others of what we believe, but to have it as a strong and grounded reference point when questioning the ideas and assumptions of others. It is more important to make people question their own ideas and assumptions than it is to convince them of new ones. That's how you combine wisdom or knowledge with humility. So obviously, in order to know something, we must have a starting point. What we have is actually two starting points. One that we are conscious beings, and the other that a world exists outside of us. A non-dualistic view would incorporate and acknowledge both of these perspectives, or facts, reducing everything to being our own solipsistic fantasy world, where only we exist and create the world, or that consciousness is the illusion and we are only biological machines reacting mechanistically, are both partial and simplistic dualistic propositions. Timeless education should transcend both these views. Another thing that should be acknowledged is that we don't know what either matter or consciousness really is. We can witness or experience that they exist, and we can even predict and understand how they function, but we cannot know what their essence is. The closest thing to an essence is that they are both moving, since they change or deteriorate over time, and that we have reason to believe they share a strong connection of some sort, because things that are completely separate cannot influence or work through the other. And so philosophers and scientists tend to reach the conclusion that there is one primal substance, or configuration of fundamental forces behind all phenomena. But physicists have yet to discover an indivisible particle. And in fact, as Leibniz pointed out, only a spiritual substance is capable of activity. Matter, as we know, is passive. Substance or energy is moved. Only thought or information can initiate action. However, words like spirit or thought are also merely words, pointing at things where the essence is unknown. Are thoughts also energy, and thus also matter in some sense? If that's the case, then couldn't we also turn this around and ask, if matter is energy and seemingly not indivisible, then couldn't it be thought in some sense? Now here it is important that people don't misunderstand. When I put forward the idea that divisible matter or energy is thought, I do not mean that matter is conscious. I do not mean that matter is the result of our thoughts. I simply mean that matter and thought are different degrees or different results of the same thing. Just as matter can exist in solid form, liquid form, and gas, this primal substance or force can exist as dead matter, living force, and psychological phenomena. And just as we might not always be able to perceive gas, we also don't perceive the higher forms of this substance or force. We know that many invisible things and energies exist that we cannot see. We used to call one of them ether. Today we use names like dark energy. For the sake of convenience, I call it dark quanta or hypermotion. But regardless of what we call it, matter, consciousness, ether, dark energy, hypermotion, is it still not the same thing in different degrees? And is its fundamental essence still not unknown? With that said, we should still look at matter, biology, and consciousness as a continuum. When a person's personality changes due to a tumor or damage to the biological brain, we can conclude that there is a link. What can be damaged during life will obviously not survive the death of the organic body. The only thing that seemingly doesn't change is the inner observer. And the inner observer is that which finds itself in the dream world at night, so it doesn't seem to go out. But certainly it can lose memory, since we don't always remember our dreams. If this inner core is permanent enough, it may even survive the death of the physical body and melt into this invisible higher realm of conscious hyperenergy, and then through some process be recycled at the top of another energy structure that anchors it to the material mechanic state of energy. The inner observer, or core of consciousness, is like the stillness of the eye within a cyclonic storm, and everything else is degrees of motion that simulates phenomena and substance through the temporary equilibrium of opposing electric wave pressures, since motion requires the oscillation or interplay of opposites. Hence motion and the interplay of opposites is the ultimate reality or solid ground of metaphysics and ancient spiritual systems. Timeless education formulates it this way. In terms of physics, we may think of alpha and omega as the electric polarity, while magnetism would be the expression of balance between this polarity that constitutes fundamental motion. The inclusion of a second omega in this formula is necessary in order to understand transition, which again must be polarized with the original condition. Hence why spirit and matter, or mind and body, must constitute a polarity in order to give rise to the phenomena of motion we call life. Once we have this polarity of dimensions, in addition to the polarity of fundamental forces, we have a miniature picture of the universe expressed in 9 aspects or numbers. This miniature picture is something like a fractal that organizes both small and large forms as long as they are complete. In other words, it can be applied to any scale and functions like an organizing structure or a cosmic tree. Thus we have our gradual continuum of manifestations with polarized dimensions considered as basic units that form the electric waves of motion, which create the various pressure conditions which are needed to produce the many seemingly different elements of visible and invisible matter. Part of this process may also involve an absorption of invisible energy by visible matter, giving rise to the phenomena of gravity. Matter, which is form, is organized by motion governed by invisible laws. The manifest accepts form and assumes the picture of something invisible yet analogous. The atoms, molecules, cells, etc. follow an invisible structural design that maintains their specific pressure conditions or states. Without this, the spin of electrons might as well fly off in all directions. This is why what we call matter could be considered as information or ideas that are played through motion so fast that it appears like substance. This is why people have even speculated that our world is a hologram in an extraterrestrial computer simulation. But maybe it simply means that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, and not simply an emergent phenomenon or something unusual. Our universe is a universe of life, not dead matter. So by no means is the human energy structure simple. It is very complex. The observable structure merges continuously into the unobservable, but it is all structured. And the realm of consciousness and higher consciousness is governed by laws just as the rest of the universe. Only these laws allow for more freedom and creativity than the lower mechanistic structures. And no doubt this freedom is related to a higher velocity in motion. We cannot have as much control over matter as we have our thoughts and memories, since matter is vibrating much slower and consists of much denser electric wave pressures or energy states. That's why we can only make changes in the world through laborious physical action directed by thoughts or by machines and technology, and why instant manifestations are simply not possible. All miracles belong to the psychological world. The physical world must be considered as a necessary limitation imposed upon conscious beings in order to create friction and meaning. If we escape into fantasy, then yes, we are more free to control our joy and preferences. This is the appeal of escapism, and why spirituality is often used as a form of escapism. But we quickly lose a sense of substance and reality when we escape into our mind and into fantasy. So we must embody all the levels of our being in order to be non-dual and actualized. We must not just be mind or awareness, we must also be emotions, animal energy and physical body. Some people are more partial to the mind, others to feelings, and others to animal energy. But few embody all of these aspects of ourselves, all of our being. Until we are all of these things in balance, we are not fully real, not fully embodied. But remember that being is not the same as attachment. Being is simply awareness and contact with energies, and allowing these energies to do their natural thing. So for now, that's it about non-dualism, cosmology and consciousness.